Wars of the Lord.
Yeah.
Is the only information on it the singular verse in Numbers?
Reference to the.
Let's have class in St.
You should download it to your file.
All right, prayer requests. I'm gonna pull that door too. Alex, that's right there. Keith? Better?
Better.
Okay.
It's currently, 14 days after we're on, they can get more definite answers. I'm feeling well right now.
Yes. We pray for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Pray for you.
Mission trip next week to Charleston, student trip.
Arlington, Texas. We've got a group leaving, you're leaving tomorrow to London. So pray for Dylan and the team as they go to, I think you're working with Belmore, is that right?
Yeah, the specific, there's two teams, so there's two churches, us and another church. The plan right now that Scott told us is that we'll be working with the which I believe that's the college has 20+ nationalities from Virginia. So,
Excellent. Safe travel from here.
yeah. Also just the fact that that specific college was like a lot of professors today. Students as well, but especially professors that like openly oppose the gospel. So having gospel conversations on the campus can be kind of hard to navigate, but
Should be fun.
yeah.
Anybody else? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we are thankful for this week as it's coming to a close. We are thankful for this opportunity for this mission team to go to the UK. We pray for their safe travel there. Pray for their work with this college campus, with the students. Pray for opportunities to share the gospel with faculty and students. Also, let the students enjoy the culture of Greater London. It's a wonderful city. It's a very lost city. Move in their hearts to love those people. But we pray for Keith. We're thankful that he's no longer in the hospital, but we do pray for answers for him as he's kind of working through what's going on with his heart. Let that monitor that will be there for 2 weeks, give them the data and information they need for him to figure out what's going on. And pray for our students as they will enjoy the city over the next 5 days. I pray for the safety of not just our students, but for the city itself. It's a wonderful time to be part of the city, intermingling with visitors who come here, but also those residents that need to hear the gospel. Pray that those opportunities would arise. In your name we pray. Amen. So I think what I'm going to do, right toward the end, let me look at the schedule. I think what I'm going to do is have Micah do Jacob for us. So I'll get us through this class period. And then Tuesday, no class. Thursday, I will have Micah do whatever he wants, starting in chapter 24 through the end of the book. I will then field all questions from Gordon Wenham, his essay on the gods of the God of the patriarchs. It's a lot there. It's going to bleed into Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 6. So there's going to be some overlap in that regard. Those are going to be probably the most difficult lecture days we have, to be honest. So just be prepared. And it's going to be really from the perspective of outside of our evangelical circle. When I use that term broadly, I'm talking anybody who says they're an evangelical Christian from a biblical perspective. I'm not talking about politics. The conversation of Israelite religion outside of that circle is the wild, wild west. And you need to be aware of that. And in fact, there's far more influence of the wild, wild west making it into our circle than our circle influencing the other opinions. And so I'm slowly seeing it seep into evangelicalism quite a bit, actually. I won't name names, but I'm editing a book on that very topic with two other guys. And several of those articles are written by evangelicals. And if I were to have you read them, you would come back and say, now, which ones are the evangelicals? And I would say, exactly. So they're starting to see some bleeding on that. So we're going to jump right into Abraham. We're going to start, kind of intersect a little bit with, I think it's pronounced Niehaus, his essay a little bit. And then we're going to spend some time, I don't even know how to pronounce the last guy's name, but we're going to deal with his on Genesis 22. We may touch a little bit of what Ellen Davis does, but Ellen Davis was much more pastoral in nature, much more like how to do this, apply it to church. So we're going to jump right into chapter 12. I won't rehearse everything that I do in OT survey. I just expect most of you to remember it. If you recall from OT survey, I talk about that from Genesis 12 to 22, there's these high points and low points kind of working its way through the narrative. From chapter 12 to the birth of Isaac is 40 years. And God speaks to Abraham 5 times. It does not suggest that he only talked to God 5 times, but it just says in the text over 40 years, there are those 5 conversations. So Niehaus has suggested he's pushing back against this idea that the Abrahamic covenant is actually covenants plural. In chapter 15, 17, and 22 represent distinct covenants with God. He argues that they are what? Supplements, right? He, I think, correctly points out that Genesis 12 in and of itself is not a covenant, that it is a what? I remember his exact phraseology. So it's the beginning, it's the promise, but it's beginning the relationship. God is relationally interacting with Abraham. All right. All right. So, which is how I teach it. In fact, that's how I teach most of Genesis. God is a relational deity with Adam, Noah, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and he's going to be relational with Moses. But with Moses, there is a shift. Moses will then introduce the people at large to God, who is then relational to the nation of Israel, people of Israel. All right, so we read in chapter 11, verse 27. I don't have time to go over the ziggurat. That's survey stuff, but the Tower of Babel is mirroring the ziggurat of Mesopotamia, also found in the Yucatan Peninsula, those kinds of things. I think you remember, I think I may have mentioned there's always a temple at the top of the ziggurat. It's got typically an idol itself. Physical idol. The king of that city-state is also typically the priest. Within certain cultures, we certainly know in Babylonian cultures, I'm going fast, by the way, that they would take that idol out of the temple and they would send it around to the other city-states if they worship the same deity. We also know from studying other cultures, from looking at Babylonian, Assyrian, Ammonite, Moabite, Edomite, there's overlap of deities. So they may have different names, but like Asherah is more than likely Ishtar. So we start seeing these different cultures worshiping the same fertility deity, giving them a different name. And over years, those deities start to assimilate other aspects of other pagan deities. So there's no static. This is what Asherah looks like. This is what Ishtar looks like, because depending on the century, they may morph into growing amongst other deities. Okay. So we'll get there. That's after next week. So chapter 11, 27. Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth. In Ur of the Chaldeans, this is one of those arguments where the Chaldeans are a 7th century people. This title, therefore, has been viewed as an insertion. I would prefer to call it an update, not because it's an error, but because as these texts continue to be read, the people group of Ur are different now. It is worth noting, if you recall from that first lecture, God is calling him from modern day Iraq. And then at the end of 2 Kings, God sends them back to modern day Iraq. So everything starts with Ur. God calls Abram out of there. And because of their lack of obedience per Deuteronomy, he sends them back to where they began. And they lose the very things promised here initially in chapter 12. All right. We all know that he has his nephew Lot, who is, I think it's safe to say, I don't know if the Bible describes him this way, but I think it's like calling him a knucklehead. It's okay.
Smart.
He wasn't smart. He's a knucklehead. Okay. Chapter 12 begins with some imperatives. Niehaus points this out quite nicely. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And there's been a good bit of interpretive issues related to verse 3 as to what does that entail. And for most of us who are aware, I'm aware that most of your parents are around my age, which means really probably not your parents, but your grandparents. They believe we have to protect Israel based on this verse. I'm not telling you we aren't to protect Israel. I'm just saying it's tied to this notion. But we'll begin there. We have these imperatives: go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, which is certainly a promise, right? And this is looking towards we can look this through chapter 49, where it talks about the blessing of Judah. And then we get Numbers. We'll get to Numbers one day. Numbers 23, where it talks about the scepter and the star. We'll get to basically Deuteronomy 17, where they become a true nation with a king. All right. And then it says he'll make his name great. And so we see this perpetuated throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, where it's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So he's becoming known as the father of faith of the people. And then I will say on verse 3, I don't have time to spend a whole lot here. I do see this verse also being used and abused by prosperity gospel people. Okay, so this is one of those prosperity texts that they love to abuse. And so the question comes in, what do you do with the Barak here? The bless, I will bless. What does that entail, right? And then I will curse, or I'll have disdain for those. So any questions on that? All right, so moving on, we have verse 4 through verse 7. I will point out, it begins, Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot was with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. And he took Sarai with him, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all of his possessions which they had gathered, and the persons they had gotten in Haran. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem. Now that's interesting, because you should have already read Genesis. Why do you snicker?
Because we're in a class where we should probably read it a few times.
Yeah, you probably should have already read Genesis, but when does Shechem get named Shechem?
It's in the time of Jacob, is it not?
It's the time of Jacob. It's when Dinah is raped, and Levi and Simeon convince a guy named Shechem to all of the men of their village to be circumcised. And then while they're recovering, Levi and Simeon go through and just butcher all of those men because of the rape of Dinah. And then the text says, and that city is called Shechem. Okay, so is this foreshadowing of the general vicinity where later this event happens? Does everybody understand? So you have this Canaanite group, Shechem, who then is going to do these things to Dinah in the book of Genesis. But he comes to Shechem, and he comes to the oak of Moreh, and we know that under trees are where they would have these altars and worship services. And so it says, he comes to the oak of Moreh, and at the time Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram. So we get, first of all, God calling him in verse 1. Niehaus does a great job saying there's no context to it. There's no background to it. He's just obedient. And then he appears to him, and he says to him, to your descendants, I give this land. And so the land actually extends all the way to the Euphrates. but it's mainly desert, so no one can inhabit that portion. And then he says it builds an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him, and there he removed to the mountain east of Bethel, which is house of El, house of God, which is where later in 1 Kings 12, which we will look at 1 Kings 12 when we get to Exodus 32, where old Jeroboam decides to put one of his altars to the golden calf there. So all these things are slowly starting to, this text is really important. It's introducing locations that become very important later in the biblical narrative. Probably, I don't recall Niehaus saying this, but probably showing even in the Canaanite setting of 1 Kings 12, of, later in Genesis, these were still Abram's land. This was part of his promised possession. Okay. Also, then it says he pitched his tent there with Bethel on the east, on the west, and I know we have already taught it's Ai. It's I. Okay, it's I on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. And the Negev, if you were to look at the map, we don't have time, is what's known as the Shephelah. If you know where Beersheba is, or if you're from Alabama, Beersheba. Where Beersheba is on the map, Beersheba, southwest. And then you have Arad, which is east of there. That is called the Negev. And so that's southern, that's part of Judah in the biblical text. It is fascinating because if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 12, let's do that and look at verses 1 through 4. And then we're going to look at Jeremiah 3. So we kind of see a consistency here. And then we'll ask some inductive questions. Chapter 12. Deuteronomy. Here Moses is preaching his not chapel 20-minute sermon. It's not a 20-minute sermon by any stretch of the imagination. He's looking down into the promised land because Moab is up high and you can see it. And we're allegedly going back to Israel in the spring. Just put that on your radar. So there's an opportunity for you to go as a student. You'll understand topography when you get there. You'll see little bumps, little hills, that's where these sites were. It says, these are the statutes, the ordinances which you shall do, or be careful to do in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods. Upon the high mountains, upon the hills, and what? Under the green trees. It tells them specifically, very specific, we'll come back to this, tear down their altars, dash to pieces their pillars, and burn their asherim. We'll get to Deuteronomy. We'll talk about whatever that is. And then he says, verse 4, very important, you shall not do so to the Lord your God. As we flip over a couple of books, let's go over to the book of Judges. Look at chapter 4. Contrary to what some sermons you've heard on the internet, blog posts. Deborah is a good person. I've ever heard those sermons, read those posts. Digress. Beginning in verse 4, it says, now Deborah, a what? Prophetess, like the wife of Lapidoth, came out. That's an unfortunate name. It's Deborah. My husband's name is Lapidoth. This goes by Lap. She was judging Israel at that time. So not only is she a judge based on not the book of Judges, but Deuteronomy 16, 18, and 17, 8 through 13, she's also a prophetess. She used to sit under what? The palm of Deborah. Between Ramah and Bethel. And where was Samuel from? Ramah. He would go around in a circuit and do prophecy and judging. So that means Deborah is from the same region as old Samuel. in the hill country, and she's in what, Bethel? So now we have another point of reference that she's in the region where Abram entered. And the people of Israel came up to her for a judgment. So she also seems to be functioning under a sacred tree. And then if we go look at Jeremiah chapter 3, I won't exegete Jeremiah 3. It is a fun chapter, however. It has some colorful words. Beginning in verse 2, we don't need to read verse 1. Lift up your eyes on the bare heights and see. Where have you not been lain with? I think you can probably connect those dots. By the waysides, you sit awaiting lovers like an Arab in the wilderness. That's like an ancient Near Eastern slight, I'm pretty sure. You have polluted the land with your vile harlotry. Therefore, the showers have been withheld, and the spring rain has not come. Yet you have a harlot's brow. You refuse to be ashamed. So here it refers to the bare heights, which is the Deuteronomy 12 passage yet again. And if you remember, Deuteronomy 12 says, on the bare heights or on the hills under every green tree. And so we even read all the way back to Genesis 12. Early on in Israel's worship, they would sit under sacred trees. But there is some vagueness as to how that's being used later in the biblical text. So everybody track along. There's a book written on it that you can go and read if that wills. Verse 10, Nehas even mentions that maybe Abram fleeing to Egypt is disobedience. Did y'all catch that when he made reference that it may be disobedience? I think it's a foreshadowing of the Joseph narrative, personally. I think it's showing you that the way God brought Abram there, or Abram goes and he has provision over him to bring him out, that he will have provision with Joseph. That's how I typically read that. But what happens while in Egypt?
She's my sister.
She's my sister. Okay, and then the articles for today, the one, however you say his last name, Cretilla. Cretilla is vague, but he gives the indication that things don't go so well for Sarai. You'll recall, he is saying the text is unclear, but the text certainly seems to insinuate when the Pharaoh says that he took his wife. It's verse 19. I took her for my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And then you get verses 17. Because of Sarai, God sends afflicting things to the Pharaoh, which is also a foreshadowing of what's going to come in chapter 7 through 11 of the book of Exodus. And so I taught you in OT survey that it would appear that taking her as his wife is in the biblical sense, that she has been violated. Now, I substantiate that argument based on later in the narrative in chapter 21, chapter 20 rather, where Abraham now goes to the land in the Negev yet again, where Abimelech, this is at Beersheba, this water well that he inherits from Abimelech. And he says, she's my wife again. And this time it says that the Lord has appeared to him in a dream and says, you're a dead man. So Abimelech wakes up and goes to Abraham and says, why did you tell me she was your sister? I could have taken her as my wife, which would have been grievous, but God spoke to me in a dream. So chapter 20 seems to suggest God halts the abuse of, the taking of Sarah, whereas in chapter 12 it's vague, but it seems to indicate not great things happen. But I don't think we need to overpress that. Chapter 13, moving quickly, is where he comes back. Says Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had. And Lot was with him, which is interesting because Lot is not part of the Egypt narrative. He's just kind of kind of like Isaac kind of drops off after verse 18 in second chapter 22. Now, Abram was rich in cattle, silver, and gold, which is typically where we use the book of Job to date Job to this text, because Job's wealth is described in cattle and donkeys, right? And then it says, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, so returning there to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. And Ai is where in Joshua 7, they do not defeat Ai. You remember from Joshua 7, and then Achan or Achan steals the booty of God that's dedicated to him. Right, kind of familiar. Cost him his life. To the place where he made an altar at first, and then there Abram called on the name of the Lord, and Lot went to Abram and said, "Look, our underlings aren't getting along." And so he said, "Why don't we split up?" In verse 7, so there's no strife. So then the author is saying it's when the Canaanites and Perizzites dwell in the land. Now later, we're going to see in the book of Exodus, that's going to be expanded to the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, Hivites. So he's going to expand that. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between me and you, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself." And so he said, "You choose it. Wherever you go, if you go left, I go right, whatever." And Lot is no fool. Lot chose the Dead Sea region. It's not going to work out for him too well later, chapter 18 and 19, but he chooses what he deems to be appropriate. God then speaks to Abram in verse 14, "Lift up your eyes and look for the place upon where you're standing, north, south, east, and west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever." So Niehaus, his article is really helpful, showing you parallels to Genesis 12, 1 through 3, those promises and how they're found throughout the rest of the Abrahamic narrative. He even applies it to the New Testament concept when Paul used it in Galatians 2 and 3, if you recall. They're not charts, but they're in columns. Really helpful. So it is worth noting the concept of lifting up their eyes. So Abraham said, "Lift up your eyes and look." And Lot lifted up his eyes to look upon the land he wants. And then God says to him, "Lift up your eyes and all that you see." How would you interpret that portion based on the promise in Genesis 12, 1 through 3? Carter, how would you interpret that specific verse? Dog. Would you interpret that verse?
Verse 14.
Mm-hmm.
What was your original question in light of, did you say Genesis 3?
Genesis 12, 1 through 3. What God promises.
I mean, it looks like he's telling him everything he sees he's going to have forever.
Correct. But
So-
it's also.
My question would be like, I guess it's a question, not an interpretation. If you look at it from like a covenant theology side, like, does that mean Christians own that land? Or is it still the nation of Israel's land? And
If
depending
we
on,
have time, we'll cover that question.
depending on where you fall on that side of that spectrum, is that Christians' land now? Because it says forever.
We may come back to that later. That's like a theological, political question.
Yes.
You know how much I love politics. Those that aren't aware, that is sarcasm. Yes, Ben.
So in the last line of verse Or in chapter 12, verse 1, the last line, God says, Abraham, to the land which I will show you. And then in verses 14 and 15, it's almost as if Abraham is saying, lift up your eyes in the land which I'm showing you.
Okay, so I think we're there. Okay, you have the next part. It says the land, which is a major theological theme. It's a boring theme, but it is an important theme. The land promised by God, and the land is your barometer of your faith. How does God love to punish Israel? Drought. He loves a good drought. He loves them 3 long years, right? There's a bunch of them. He also curses the land, like he sins in the book of Exodus, the things that affect the land and the livestock, right? So what I'm looking at or looking for is God says, I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to give you this land. And before God has showed Abram the land, Abram has what? Given it to Lot. You can't give what's promised to you to someone else. That is God's promise to you, Abram. And so I think it's safe. I think Niehaus is pretty accurate here. Abram acts presumptuously often. That's not Abram's fault. He's learning who God is. So he says, look, you take whatever you want, but God, there's no God talking to Lot. It's God talking to Abram in chapter 12, telling him these things. And the first thing he says, you get to choose whatever you want. And God says, no, brother, look, lift your eyes, look north, south, east, and west. All that you see is yours. And it doesn't say it, but it implies not yours to give away. Okay. Bo, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Comment?
Do like critical scholars, would they argue that these are like in 12 and in 14, that these are two different lands? And that's why they say like, oh, these are two different covenants, different promises.
In
talk about
chapter 14?
Yes. Or sorry, 13.
13? This may shock all of you.
Well, the argument in that was like that 12, 13, 15, 17, 22 were like
Different sources.
Yes.
This is going to come as a shock to all of you. I find reading documentary hypothesis stuff is about as riveting as sitting in a room with no sound, no light, and no TV, and just have to sit there and wait for 12 hours. Like I would rather, it's not enjoyable. It's miserable. Contrary to what some of you probably think. I think Ms. Sharon asked a question at a class the other day. I think that oftentimes we can get in the weeds on trying to find these divisions of texts instead of stepping back a little bit and looking at literary connections, whether I'm not arguing sources. Even if they're arguing sources, the fact that the land promise in chapter 12, verse 1, here God said, lift up your eyes and see. Whether sources or not, there's a thematic connection between the two, and that brings unity to a text.
Why you said keep the historical critical views of authorship to a minimum. You didn't want to read all that?
It's pretty miserable. And we're also talking 100,000 pages of reading. Yes. I wish that was hyperbole. I just like to write about it. Look at verse 18 of chapter 13. And so Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. So now it's Hebron instead of Shechem. Hebron is where David's king. He's king in Hebron first. And then chapter 14 is I think we've mentioned this a little bit. It's a riddle of sorts. It just sort of interrupts, but it's kind of giving you a preview of what's going to come in chapter 18 and 19. Because Lot chooses this, he immediately gets captured. Okay, so we'll read some of it. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elashar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings made war with Barah, king of Sodom. So that's placing Lot in the area of Sodom. and Birsha, king of Gomorrah. And so they come and conquer and take them, is what they do. Verse 11, it says, so the enemy took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot and the son of Abram's brother who dwelt in Sodom and his goods and departed. Then one who had escaped, it's always the one who escapes, even in Job, right? Job chapter 1, one escapes. And one says to David, is that not Eliab's daughter? And they told Abram the Hebrew. That's interesting. Now he's a Hebrew. He's actually technically Mesopotamian, but now it's kind of previewing when's the next time the word Hebrew will be used that we know of that's famous is the Shifra and Pu of the midwives to the Hebrews, who was living at the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol and Honor. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them. I would argue the 318 proves that this is a historical account. It's not a round number. You don't fictionalize 318. Fictionalize 300, roundabout.
Unless they were one step ahead and they knew you would think that.
They were not at one step ahead of me. Not from that. And he went and pursued as far as Dan. So Dan, by the way, Dan.
Dan.
Yeah, that too. Who are the Danites?
Of the tribe of Dan.
Tribe of Dan. So the tribe of Dan,
It's definitely.
That doesn't-
Dan's not been born yet, that comes later.
Yeah.
And then Dan doesn't like where they're at. And so they then move to the north because I've been there. It's pretty swanky. It's a nice area up there in Dan these days. And he goes all the way up. You can see Mount Hermon. It's the last city, right? Like you go to, if you go to Israel, you go to Tel Dan. There's the literally 4,000-year-old city gate where Abram would have gone through that gate. It's where Solomon fortified the city. There was a temple that Solomon built there. It's also one of the pagan locations that old Jeroboam built. And you're looking actually into Lebanon. You're on the border of Lebanon. And so they have Apache helicopters that are constantly flying over, which makes it such an enjoyable visit, knowing you're secure. So clearly this text is describing something that ancient later Israelites would understand. They went this far up. In fact, Israel is described geographically from Tel Dan all the way down to Beersheba. Beersheba. 250 miles. But we know it's actually bigger than that. It actually extends further south and then in that way. So he goes up there and apparently, though in his 70s, Abram knows how to handle himself with his 318 men. And they commence to defeating them by dividing his forces in verse 15 against them by night. He and his servants, they routed them and pursued them to Haboth, north of Damascus, which is 90 miles northeast from Dan. How bad did he defeat them? He drove them 90 miles plus. I always think of old Abram with the big long beard, gray, frail. He took off for another 90 miles. After his return for the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, then we get the text that we've already looked at, right? Melchizedek text. And then the first tithe that Abram gives to Melchizedek, and we've already talked, we'll come back to this text later. Chapter 15 is then the covenant between God and Abram, because the word covenant is used, right? The house points that out. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And what is a vision? Isaiah has a vision, but that vision sure does seem real. Okay. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. Abram said, behold, you have given me this, no offspring, slave born to me in my house. And the word of the Lord came and said, this shall not be your heir, your son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said, so shall your descendants be. So let's start there. Go back to chapter 12. He says, I will make you a great nation. And so he's describing this idea of descendancy. So in chapter 13, it's the first verse. And then in chapter 14, it's the second verse. He's reiterating that covenant promise. Verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. That's kind of a famous text, would you say? Paul loves that verse. He uses it in Romans. He uses it in Galatians. So what is Abram believing in to be counted as righteous? Also, before you answer that question, based on Curvella's article, that the fearing of God of Abraham in Genesis 22 is equivalent to what we define as Christian faith. Y'all remember that in his article? So if Christian faith, based on what he's using, Moberly, by the way, RWL Moberly's article, that Abraham's faith, the way we understand faith, is Genesis 22. What then is this text, and why is Paul using this text in Romans 2 and Galatians 3 as a description of salvation in the New Testament?
It's because that this is an example of faith and promise, not in.
We'll start. So his faith is in the promise, and what is the promise? The child. I believe God will give me a descendant. Paul uses this verse messianically, does he not? Yeah, just agree with me. Paul used it messianically. That the way that Abram believed that he was counted as righteous, so to you who believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who died and resurrected, also have righteousness. Yeah. Galatians 3. I think we all agree with that. Okay. All right, so then Matthew didn't ask this question, but I'm going to ask this question. What is faith in the Old Testament? Is faith salvation in the Old Testament belief or faith? And is it faith in God, in his promises, or in a coming Messiah? Y'all ever pondered that? I do hold some things back in Old Testament survey. I don't give you all 52 cards.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Is faith in the Old Testament just simply believing God because it's God? Are you believing, is faith believing in his promise? Or is faith believing in the Messiah? Like, are the Old Testament saints believing in the Messiah figure to come? And that's what gives them faith.
I thought of it as a way of believing God that he will fulfill his promises and is capable of doing so. Because I mean, it would, I don't think Moses or Abraham was looking forward to Jesus specifically or to a Messiah in the way that Jesus was the Messiah, but having faith in the promises of God that he would bring them to completion.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't the last two that you said overlap?
Some people argue they believed in Jesus because they hold the pre-incarnate Christs, which we're not chasing that rabbit today.
Why not?
Why not? Y'all know where I stand on that.
What about Melchizedek though? You skipped that path.
For all Flexus students, I don't believe in pre-incarnate Christ. I think it invalidates the virgin birth. I don't think the angel of the Lord is pre-incarnate Christ because to which of the angels did God ever say, sit at the right hand of your Father? It's like your enemies, my footstool, that's Ballet. 1:5. that I quote. And then goes on to quote 13 texts in Hebrews 1, saying Jesus is superior to angels. If Jesus is superior to angels, he can't be an angel. Now, Zechariah 3:1-3 is the only biblical place where it does appear that the angel of the Lord is functioning as Jesus. But the irony of Zechariah 3 is they're in heaven, not on earth. Okay. And by the way, early church fathers also struggled with the notion of a pre-incarnate Christ. It kind of puts the virgin birth in a pretty weird spot. Like if Jesus was already on the earth before his birth, then what's the purpose of the virgin birth? Right. So Ben Witherington writes a good bit on that. I encourage you. We're not going to Isaiah 7. That's next spring.
I don't wanna also bring up the debate or talk about it, but what would you say to Genesis chapter 16, verse 13? When I wanna say it's, I forget the story behind it, but so she named the child Elroy, the Lord spoke to her. What would you say
The
that?
Lord sees, the God of seeing.
Yeah,
What would I say about that? And
well, I'm
what?
saying in reference to angel of the Lord in the pre-incarnate Christ.
Well, he's gonna the angel of the Lord appears often in Genesis,
Mm.
and my favorite part is when the angel of the Lord speaks and he says, "I, God."
Hmm.
Do they have a concept of that's the pre-incarnate Christ, or is that God cloaking himself as or shrouding the humans because we can never see God face to face? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. I've yet to have anyone articulate if there's a pre-incarnate Christ, how that does not diminish the value of the virgin birth. I mean, I know y'all are taught the same thing in another class. I won't mention which
He
one.
wouldn't have his human nature. And as the angel of the Lord, he would have had a human nature. By human nature, I mean like in the likeness of man.
I don't think even.
Well, you could have said, like, when I said sinful nature could be implied, no.
And look, again,
Pre-incarnate Christ wouldn't have had that.
I mean, look, the full disclosure, pre-incarnate Christ position is, it certainly sounds more spiritual. But would any of these readers ever have viewed that as that figure?
Yeah. My question would be, what about the passages where the angel of the Lord commands people to like remove their shoes for his holy ground?
Same answers when that same angel says, "I am God."
Sounds pretty simple to me.
Like that is the burning bush chapter 3. The angel spoke to him, says, "I'm Yahweh. Don't come near me. All right, upon which you're standing is holy ground."
So you make the distinction of theophanies. You believe in theophanies, just not pre-incarnate Christ.
Why would I not believe theophany? This is chapter 3. There's a theophany.
Exactly.
So
Do you think it matters which one it is?
Yeah.
So do you think there's anything wrong with believing in a pre-incarnate Christ?
I think you're wrong. I don't see a
I
problem.
never said I believed in it.
Here's the problem. Let's,
You didn't even answer my question from earlier. Yeah.
which one? What was your question?
Do we own Israel or is it?
That's not a question for this class. Like, what kind of question is that?
So didn't you bring up the point against pre-incarnate Christ is that would the readers of this text understood that as Christ?
Right. Yeah.
Well, then can't you look at just about any messianic
Yeah.
prophecy and say that same thing?
Potentially. If you read Cravella, he quotes R.W.L. Mobley. What y'all thoughts on this quote? We're going to cover this quote anyway. It works here. If the Old Testament no longer says something to the Christian in its own right, to which the Christian still needs to attend and on which Christian faith necessarily builds, its actual role within Christian faith will tend to become marginal and optional, no matter what rhetoric is used to urge its importance. So if your whole dynamic of reading the Old Testament is through a Christocentric lens, which by the way, he pushes back on. Even shows in early church fathers, they did not view the Akedah as messianic. I mean, that whole first section of his essay was that church fathers and John Calvin, who's not always right, do not equate Isaac functioning as the sacrifice of Christ. And yet we all would agree that's kind of how it's treated in our churches. Again, this is where, this is not this class, we have a lot to cover, but we need a class on intertextuality. We need a class, which y'all have a class on biblical theology, but there's also methodological presuppositions on biblical theology. Where are they Christocentric, where you find Christ in the Old Testament, whether it be Christophanies or pre-incarnate Christ as the angel of the Lord, or do you take a Christotelic position, which is what I do and most of the Old Testament faculty on seminary campus do, not all, most, which most of the New Testament guys as well. And it goes back to hermeneutics. It's if we teach you the role of hermeneutics is one way, and then you just immediately turn to a typological Christocentric interpretation, as Marley would say, you have just flattened the value of the Old Testament. You have now created a canon within a canon. That the New Testament is superior to the Old Testament. Now, y'all may believe that. That's fine. But based on the plenary verbal view of inspiration, all texts are all equally inspired. Correct? I mean, that's Christian doctrine. That's doctrine. That's a revelation of Scripture. This is one of those classes in theology are so vitally important beyond just biblical studies classes. Awesome.
This might be an entirely different can of worms, but it's different but the same.
Before you start, who eats a can of worms, by the way? Why do you use that phrase? Is it for fishing?
I think it's for fishing, yeah.
How do they survive? I prefer, live ones.
It's a can.
The fish don't care.
It's if it's dead or alive.
But you mentioned that like to believe in a pre-incarnate Christ diminishes the virgin birth of Christ.
Yeah, I'm not alone. I can start naming world-class conservative evangelicals that argue that.
Wouldn't believing in the Isaiah 7 passage being a virgin birth at the end also diminish Mary?
Since none of us do believe that was a virgin birth.
Okay.
I don't. The guy that taught you Genesis last semester doesn't.
Okay. That's why I was.
None of us.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it doesn't say.
So that is an interpretation that some people have offered that.
It's a flawed one, yeah, because they don't understand that Alma, which means young woman, is not Betula, which means virgin. So you can thank the Septuagint for that.
Well, I know, but I just had a question because if some people do believe that, then
Yeah, they got a problem.
yeah.
We've got a problem. We got a virgin birth in the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
Especially because Hezekiah was not born of a virgin, because that's who the baby is. Yeah. You had a question, John?
Yeah, you may have even answered, I missed it. But it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't matter who appeared to them. If it's God or Jesus Christ, they're both God.
Yeah, look, I think I would even argue that a theophany could theoretically be a Christophany, but that kind of problematic when Daniel 7 and 9 talks about him as the old man. Or is that just a God being the Ancient of Days? Yeah, that's kind of
Is that the literal translation of ancient days? Old man.
yeah. That was
That's the Jeff translation.
that was the Jeff's country boy paraphrase.
The old man coming.
So how about what if there are, so typically people say it's faith in God, it's faith in the promise, that God's promises will be true, or is the faith in the Messiah?
Would they still have been holding to the Genesis 3, your seed will crush the head of the serpent? Would they still be holding to?
Well, since the entire Old Testament doesn't view that text as messianic. Like y'all read on that, like it's an early church Christian tradition.
Can it not be?
I mean, from the idea of like bringing forth children of like,
Yeah, so I think what's ended up happening is, so I think there are different descriptions of what faith looks like in the Old Testament. Like, I think in this section, this text is like, he is counted righteous because he believes the promise of a descendant.
Yeah.
But Moses doesn't have that same commitment to that as his faith is. His faith is in what? The God that's talking to me in this burning bush.
Yeah.
The God who reveals himself in chapter 6 is this. So we now have different portraitures of what does faith look like, which would suggest that Genesis 22 is the faith of Abraham.
So what you're getting at is that not everybody, if his seed would have been his seed, that other people would have been his seed that would have owned the land in Genesis.
I don't even know what you're asking.
Yeah. Ben, what's your opinion?
I'm gonna do that to him.
You missed. It's a double. I'm good. And I'm looking at biblical theology this morning, and someone Jackson turns around and hands me a Torah that's in Hebrew. I'm like, oh, personally, I think the Old Testament saints got saved the same way that we did. It was cry night at camp, and they went up during the altar day.
Up in smoke that night. You know, Carr sings a couple of extra refrains. Lowers her voice and just screams out loud. It's just.
Everybody's got to close their eyes and raise their hand if they want to get sick.
It's much fun now. It's just like the same.
See a hand over here. There's not one.
This chair has a question, the car has a question, and
I have like a comment.
let's go with the sheriff first.
So about the promise in chapter 12, where he says, I will, meaning God's going to do something. And then he shows him in chapter 13 where he says, look for where I'm going to show you. And so he's moving from a place where he doesn't have enough room on the land for sheep because he had to split with Lot, right? And so then God's saying, it is going to happen. And look at all the land I'm going to give you. And he says, and then how come he believes? Hebrews gives us more insight into this, right? Because he says, Abraham believed in what he couldn't even see. He was looking forward to picture even what he sees in the land.
I'm just trying to figure out why they're watching movies.
So I just think it's interesting to think about when you're talking about who is he believing in? Is he believing in the Christ or what is he believing? He's believing in what he sees. He's also believing in the promise that God has told him about what is to come, because that's what Hebrews explains to us.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is to use Lawson's phrase, a very big can of worms. You used it, we don't have time to chase that rabbit. 1 Corinthians 10 is an issue of intertextuality because Paul interprets the rock in the wilderness of Exodus and Numbers pretty significantly different.
That's pre-incarnate Christ.
He interprets the Exodus account, the crossing of the Red Sea, in a very unique way. And every scholar I have ever looked at interprets 1 Corinthians 10 as allegory. So if Paul is writing an allegory, and that's correct, I'm saying if they're correct, then to what extent then is the author of Hebrews, Priscilla, also adding information? Like the author of Hebrews includes things that are never found in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So is that via progressive revelation. It comes into like Abraham believed that God would resurrect Isaac.
But that's never.
That's never promised. And I can safely say resurrection in the Old Testament is something that's not really well known or believed. There's only potentially 2 cases of resurrection. And so, and I can say that safely because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. You have a whole group of them that don't, and modern day Orthodox Jews do not believe in the resurrection. And so it's a complex topic. And I have for years asked for a class on intertextuality. It has fallen on deaf ears. Carter has a question. We have to actually get through more than a handful. Like, I would like to get to Exodus. I'm well read.
Yeah.
You had a comment.
I have your question?
Did I answer your question, Ms. Sharon? I'm sorry. I answered it. I answered it in Jeff's fashion, I assure you. But I answered.
I'm just thinking about the whole big picture of how God is talking
Yeah,
to
so
Old Testament people about what's coming and their promise, and they're looking forward, and that's what Abraham did. They looked forward.
and so Ms. Sharon's question or comment is really helpful. That's why we do have biblical theology class. That's why we built the biblical theology class to then look at the meta narrative or the arc of Scripture. But also in those discussions are different presuppositional approaches to reading Scripture, like a Christocentric compared to a Christotelic. And so depending on one's theological reading is how you would read those arcs. And so I'm very unwavering in mine. I'm not argumentative about it. I still see any value in it, but I'm very much, this is my readings. My views of intertextuality are very, very specific. And that's why we need that class. I don't think I should teach that class. I think it should be someone else. But I do think a robust understanding of how the New Testament writers use the Old Testament is paramount, because there's actually 3 ways they use the Old Testament. And then there's also the Hillelian 7 models of Jewish interpretation they use as well. So Paul uses, he's familiar with 4 different ways of interpreting texts. 2 of them we teach in hermeneutics. You don't have permission to do it that way. Like we really tell you on that. You have a comment. And then let's actually talk about the option.
Question, it's just kind of making sure that the option number
If I
2.
recall, 10 minutes ago, you started this disaster with your comment. Yeah, go ahead. Continue.
That's good.
Thank you.
Part 2 and 3, like the options, was his promises or the Messiah. Is there specific separation of those 2?
I do. I think the promise is that God, kind of what Ms. Sharon pointed out earlier, that he will, I will. And so his belief is that God will do the very things he's promised. That's separate from a messianic
Promise of
Yeah.
the Messiah.
And the only reason I bring that up is because number 1, you need to know what you believe about how people were saved in the Old Testament. Number 2, most of you were taught that they believed in Jesus, which is if you hold that view, great for you, right? I certainly don't hold that view. And which is one of the reasons why I don't try to push my interpretation or views on y'all. Like, it's just not fair. I don't think it's not, my job is not to indoctrinate. I don't think any of our jobs should be to indoctrinate you. We have to go to chapter 15. You can talk about it. I see you all the time. That's what I know.
I have a short.
No, you don't.
I promise I do.
No, you open up a can of worms. We got to keep going. I see you, buddy. Chapter 15, verse 7. See, it's fast so, bro. All right, verse 7. Man, I enjoy walking up and slapping a hornet's nest. It is fun.
If you just believe the right stuff, you wouldn't have to.
The best thing I can tell you is I stand on the tradition of centuries of other believers that hold the same view.
So does the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I will stand with those early church fathers all day long, my friend. All day long, my man. Augustine himself was technically. Verse 7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you up from Ur of the Chaldeans. By the way, that's going to be also the formulaic use later. I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of
Egypt.
Here we go. To give you this land to possess. So now it's revisiting back to the land. And he said to him, bring me a heifer 3-year-old, she-goat 3-year-old, ram 3-year-old, turtle dove, young pigeon. He brought them to these. Does this read like a vision, or does this read like this is happening in real time?
It's happening.
Yes. And then it says, and cut them into and lay them in each half over and against itself. It does not, as it says, and he brought them. Now we assume, and I think it's fair to say, we can assume God tells Abram to bring these things, and he doesn't. But I've heard a scholar argue that he brought them can also imply that God cut them in half. Now, why would we even consider God cutting them in half? Because of what happens after this. And it says, he did not cut the birds in two, and when the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, now Abram's name is mentioned. Abram drove away all the birds from eating the carcasses. As the sun goes down, again, this doesn't read like a vision. This reads like this is happening in real time. A deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, he is asleep. So now this kind of goes back to the vision part. He's asleep. God speaks to him. Know for a certainty that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be slaves there. So here he's prophesying about the Exodus from Joseph to Exodus 1 through verse 7. And they will be slaves there for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions, which is also part of that chapters 4 and 5. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. That's a reference to Joseph. When the sun had gone down, it's already dark because he's asleep. But the sun goes down, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Verse 18, in my opinion, is terrifying. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. It does not say on that day, Abraham and God made a covenant, because he went through those cut animals. Now, we believe this covenantal ceremony is where you would cut the animals in half and the blood would pool together. Y'all remember that? And the blood pools together and they walk through the blood. So if Logan and I make a covenant and we walk through that blood, if he breaks that covenant, we get to do that to his family. If I break that covenant, he gets to do that to my family. Meanwhile, Abram's over here with a divine melatonin knockout punch while God goes through those cut animals. And God tells him while he is asleep, God, made a covenant with you. And God does not break his covenants. We break his covenants. It's a death sentence for all those who break the covenant of God. And in fact, we don't have time, as I think very, very much so, Ms. Sharon is right. We need to start thinking big term, big picture. But these classes we focus here, and that's when we have biblical theology, is every time Israel steps out of step, what does God do? He kills every last one of them and starts over. In fact, he uses the language with Noah and Moses, I will make you what? A great people or nation. And so God's covenant never changes. He just removes us out of the equation and goes to the next relational person he interacts with, and the covenant never changes. And so this is how you'll remember, we'll run out of time today, I'm sure, how I interpret Sodom and Gomorrah, which we'll probably get there. And so then he says, I made a covenant with Abram saying, to your descendants, I give this land. In other words, stop questioning me. I'm giving you this land, which goes back to your question, which is political, which we'll answer outside of class. And now we see the groups of people or more. It says, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the Canaanites, Kenizzites, Kenamites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Ammonites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Now, chapter 16, we won't cover, but I think we all know what happens. Is the first thing he does is Sarai's womb is closed, because that's kind of how all famous kids are born in the Bible, by barren mothers. And so she gives her Egyptian slave, and he fathers Ishmael. Okay? If you're familiar with much of Islam, Islam argues that the Jews have corrupted the original text, that Ishmael was the one who was bound in Genesis 22, that he is the chosen child of God, not Isaac. But essentially what we have is Sarah, which means princess, shows herself not to be very princessish here, right? She's mean to Hagar, to the point that Hagar then has to flee, and she puts the child under a tree and waits to let the child die so she can't see the child die, which is also probably a little bit what's happening with the book of Exodus, when Moses' mother puts him in a basket, floats him down the river, which we'll cover in due course. Okay, so, but we also find, as Kromansky points out, God has a plan for Ishmael. God has a plan for Ishmael twice in Genesis, where even though Sarai has ill will toward this child, which is mind-boggling, that God still has a plan, which is also we're going to find with Rachel and Leah. Michael will cover that they start having a baby contest, and when they can't have babies, they start giving him their handmaids. All right, chapter 17. Niehaus argues this is a supplement to the covenant. This is where circumcision takes place. It says 99 years old. So from chapter 12 to chapter 17 have transpired 24 years. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, I am the God, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Which is a bit weird. Niehaus makes a big deal that the covenant is singular throughout this, and that this supplement, but this seems to be, as Niehaus points out, scholars are saying these are two different sources, two different covenants. I'm perfectly fine with seeing it being a supplement, but it is odd that he's now making a covenant. And we know what that covenant is, that he is to remove the excess foreskin of his phallus, and that circumcision is not unique to ancient Israel. It's actually also practiced in Egypt. It is the sign of the covenant, and it plays a prominent role throughout the rest of the Old Testament. We know that in Exodus 4, which we'll look at Exodus 4, those are some weird texts, right? We also know in Joshua 5 that those that came out of the land of Egypt into the wilderness, all of them have been circumcised, but their children had not been. And in Joshua 5, God requires them to be circumcised in Joshua 5. But we also then have to throw in, what do you do with Deuteronomy 10:16, Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, and Jeremiah 4:4, where it says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart, not the sign of the covenant. Like, this is a far more complex topic. And then in Romans chapter 2, verse 28, 29, Paul says, for circumcision is a matter of the what? Heart. Yeah. So Paul seems to be reading Jeremiah 4:4, Deuteronomy 36, and Deuteronomy 10:16, and yet here is another tradition of, it's a covenant of obedience. Okay, it would take 6 weeks to heal from circumcision today as an adult. And they would do it with flint knives, not the tool they use today. Yes, I have asked a doctor because I think it's worth noting. Now, it also is worth noting, I won't use my marker. Won't do that again. But essentially you have in chapter 15, chapter 12 is the promise. Chapter 15, animals are cut in half. The first thing he does is he procreates with someone not his wife. He has taken upon himself to have his own descendants. In the very next chapter, we're told you must circumcise the foreskin. And if you flinch, this is from the book by a guy named Bodstra, that if you flinch, you're no longer able to have children. And so now you go from cutting animals to now what? Cutting your own flesh. And that becomes a sign of the covenant. It's applied to all males 8 days old or older. So you can read all that through there. Joshua 5 is a key text there. And then chapter 18, 19, we'll cover that quickly. I'll let Micah do the Akedah, chapter 22, and then Jacob next class period. All right, so we have, everyone knows the story. So you have three, what appear to be angels, divine beings, go to Sodom, right? And the people, the men of Sodom come out and they desire to know those men. Okay? And so then Lot, clearly an upstanding citizen, says, oh, don't do that. Here are my two virgin daughters. All right. A couple of things we're going to talk about in our last 4 minutes. Number one, I don't believe that this is actually, it is, I know it, I know, but I think it's beyond what you think. This is not just about homosexuality. This is actually rape. Like that's what they're trying to rape them. They're trying to humiliate the three divine beings. And Lot offers his daughters for rape. By the way, should not shock you because you get to the book of Judges at the end, what happens?
The Israelites do the same.
Same thing. They rape this poor woman, and then her husband, being so kind and generous, chopped her into pieces, put her in a box, sent her off, and then, tribe of Judah got it and said, what's in the box? No, I digress. That's it. That's funny. I don't care who you are. That's funny. Maybe quote. It is rape that is homosexual. It is meant to dehumanize. Okay, I think if you want to argue it's a certain sexual lifestyle, that's fine. It's more than that. And those are divine beings, and God is going to destroy. Okay? Now, let's briefly talk about the bartering of Abraham and God. One of the articles you read does a great job discussing this dialogue between God and these divine beings, and Abraham overhears his divine plan to destroy. And so Abraham begins to ask questions. What if there are 50, 45, 50, 40, 30, 20? Will you destroy it? He goes all the way down to 10. What does God say? Well, if there are 10 godly ones there, I won't do it, which tells you there aren't any. There's not 10. Jeremiah, by the way, I think this has to be early because Jeremiah tries that little stunt. Y'all ever read Jeremiah's account? Jeremiah's clever, by the way. I like Jeremiah. He's clever. He walks through the same numbers, but he's smart. He says, what if there's one? And God's response is what? There's not even one Jeremiah. It's like, I'm in the city. What are you talking about? I'm one. That's why I said one. I said one because I think I'm righteous. And God, what is God? I think that actually Jeremiah text actually helps interpret this. There is no bartering. It appears as bartering. And when Jeremiah says, what if there's one? God's response is, Jeremiah, destruction has already been divinely set. There is no one righteous. Even though you are a godly person. And guess who doesn't die in that situation? Jeremiah. He gets taken out of the city. So he never loses his life in that city. So even though he is reprimanded, God made sure that he was spared. Much like Lot was spared. And to be fair, I don't think Lot deserved to be spared. But that's where you get the rest of that chapter, which is a little wild with his daughters, which I don't think I have to rehearse for us here. So what do you think about, so this is where open theism comes in, right? The doctrine of open theism. Does God, do our request and prayer, does God change? Can he be bartered with? You know my position. I don't even know to tell you, but is this more of a learning exercise? Y'all remember, those of you who had me in the seat, remember the story of my friend that got beat up by his father when I was in high school. So Miss Sharon and John and I are old enough to remember us being spanked in schools, and parents could hit their kids and nothing really happened. I had a friend do something he shouldn't have done to his mother, and my dad, his dad got home and said, I need you to talk to you in your room, in the room. And he walked in his room. He said, did you do this to your mother? He said, yes, sir. And he punched him in the face. And he said, that's the last time you will ever do that again. And the reason we know that is because he showed up with a black eye to baseball practice. What happened to you? He told us the story. And if I'm just really honest with you, every teenage boy that played sports at some point in their life thought, I could whoop my daddy. And Ross learned that day, he cannot whip Jim. I interpret that text through that horrible story from 1992 that Abram and Abraham, his name's changed, has been living cavalierly. He's faithfully obeying, but then backsliding because he's learning who this deity is. And now God, I think as the question goes, should we show him what we're about to do? You know, I think Carvella's article brings up some really good questions. Like one of the best questions was, why would Abraham even be willing to do that to Isaac? I think chapter 18 and 19 show him a pretty good reason why he should do it. Is that he finally realized the God he is worshiping is patient and long-suffering, but also demands faithfulness and obedience. And so Abraham was far more compelled to do that. Now, Michael will be here next Thursday. I will double check. I don't think Carvella ever says why he does it. It's because child sacrifices is well known at that time. That God's going to redirect that. Word of the day is angel of the Lord. 4 words. Angel of the Lord. There you go.
Think there's any connection between I know we'll get into the religion of patriarchs, but that open theism, as in what Abraham would want to do, because, oh, you guys shut off the play.